Welcome to the depths of the mind. Tonight we will explore the 60 darkest psychology tricks, secrets hidden within human behavior, manipulation tactics, and eerie psychological phenomena. As you drift between consciousness and slumber, let these truths seep into your subconscious.
1 to 10. The subconscious abyss. 1. The illusion of free will. Most of your choices aren't truly yours. The mind is a machine responding to unseen triggers planted by others. Historical experiment. Neuroscientist Benjamin Libert's famous study demonstrated that the brain initiates decisions before we consciously become aware of them. This suggests that our perception of free will may be a post-rationalization rather than an actual autonomous decision-making process. Real-world application. Advertisers and media carefully curate choices, leading consumers toward predetermined conclusions while making them believe they had independent control over their decisions. Manipulation tactic. A person can be nudged toward a decision by presenting selective information, limiting their perceived options, and reinforcing their autonomous choice through social validation. Expanded insight. The illusion of free will is also evident in how people rationalize their actions after the fact. Studies on political decisions, consumer behavior, and even interpersonal relationships suggest that we often make subconscious choices first, only to later construct a narrative that aligns with our self-image. This means that those who understand how subconscious triggers work can effectively write the script for someone else's decisions without them ever realizing it. 2. Cognitive dissonance. Contradicting beliefs create internal tension, forcing people to justify actions they wouldn't normally take. Case study. Leon Festinger's study on cult members in When Prophecy Fails revealed how, after a doomsday prophecy failed, believers became even more devout rather than abandoning the belief. They rationalized the failure as proof of their faith's strength. How it's used. Governments, religious leaders, and corporations use this to create loyalty. For instance, a person who has spent thousands on a luxury brand is more likely to justify their purchase rather than admit they were deceived by marketing. Weaponizing. This. By forcing someone to act against their initial belief and providing them with an excuse afterward, they can be persuaded to adopt a new worldview. Expanded insight. Cognitive dissonance is why people often double down on bad investments, stay in toxic relationships, or justify unethical actions. It is also one of the key psychological levers behind radicalization and cult recruitment. Once a person has sacrificed something, time, money, or personal values, they become emotionally invested, making them more susceptible to further persuasion. Understanding this can allow for both self-awareness and the ability to subtly guide others towards specific beliefs or actions. 3. Sleep conditioning. The mind is most vulnerable before sleep, making whispered affirmations or repeated thoughts shape reality. Scientific basis. Hypnopedia, sleep learning, was explored in Soviet experiments where soldiers trained with verbal cues during light sleep performed better in tasks requiring pattern recognition. Real-world manipulation. The military, cults, and even corporations use this by playing subliminal messages or exposing recruits to repeated slogans before sleep to reinforce ideology. Try this. Whisper a belief to yourself as you drift off. I am in control. Over time, your subconscious mind begins to accept it as truth. Expanded insight. Sleep conditioning is a potent tool because during the hypnagogic state, the phase between wakefulness and sleep, the brain is especially receptive to suggestion. This is why propaganda, religious indoctrination, and even personal affirmations can be amplified if repeated before falling asleep. The placebo effect is particularly strong in this state, meaning that ideas implanted during this phase can shape not only perceptions but actual behavior over time. 4. Priming. A single word planted in your mind can subtly alter your future decisions without you realizing it. Psychological study. John Bargh's research showed that participants who were primed with words related to old age, such as frail and wrinkle, walked more slowly than those given neutral words. Real-world use. Politicians carefully structure their speeches to use emotionally charged priming to make you feel certain ways about policies before logically assessing them. Dark application. Manipulators use priming to make you doubt yourself. Repeatedly hearing words like forgetful or careless can make you subconsciously behave as if those traits define you. Expanded insight. Priming is especially powerful because it taps into the brain's associative memory. If a person repeatedly hears phrases like strong leader, they will unconsciously associate those words with whoever is being described. In a more sinister application, toxic relationships often involve a form of negative priming, subtle, persistent criticisms that erode confidence and increase dependence on the manipulator. 5. The mere exposure effect. The more you see something, the more you trust it, even if it's a lie. Advertising strategy. Marketers use this principle to make slogans, jingles, and brands familiar, increasing your likelihood of choosing them over unfamiliar options. Psychological danger. Propaganda utilizes this by exposing the public to the same idea repeatedly until it becomes an unquestioned truth. Manipulative tactic. Repetition of a false narrative eventually convinces people of its accuracy, even in the face of contradictory evidence. Expanded insight. The mere exposure effect is why misinformation spreads rapidly. Repeated exposure creates a sense of familiarity, which is then mistaken for credibility. This is why advertising works, why political lies persist, and why conspiracy theories can gain traction. The trick is knowing how to filter repeated messages critically and identify when you are being influenced without realizing it. 6. Dark anchoring. Your expectations can be manipulated by presenting an extreme starting point. Example: if a salesman initially tells you a car is worth $50,000 and then offers it for $30,000, you feel like you're getting a deal, even if the actual value is lower. How it's used. News media use anchoring by presenting shocking statistics, altering your perception of what is normal afterward. Weaponization. Negotiators use high-ball, low-ball anchoring to make counterparts subconsciously adjust their expectations before bargaining even begins. Expanded insight. Anchoring works because people tend to rely too heavily on the first piece of information they receive. A job interviewer who starts by mentioning an industry average salary of $150,000 makes a $100,000 offer seem low. Likewise, an online store showing a discounted price after an inflated original price makes buyers feel like they're saving money, even if the final cost is still higher than market value. 7. Subliminal commands. Hidden messages in sounds, images, or words shape your reality unconsciously. Case study. The infamous Drink Coca-Cola experiment in movie theaters allegedly increased sales through hidden messages. Real-life danger. Political campaigns insert visual and auditory subliminals to associate opponents with negative emotions. Tactical use. In everyday life, framing words carefully in emails, texts, and conversations can plant unconscious biases in others. Expanded insight. Subliminal commands work because the brain processes vast amounts of information below conscious awareness. Psychological studies suggest that messages flashed for even milliseconds can alter perceptions and behaviors. Governments, advertisers, and even social media algorithms employ these techniques, shaping public opinion and consumer habits without direct awareness. 8. Dopamine manipulation.
Your brain craves unpredictability, making it vulnerable to addiction and manipulation. Examples: casinos design slot machines with randomized rewards to create addiction. How you're affected. Social media platforms leverage intermittent likes and notifications to keep users engaged for hours. Personal experiment. Try disabling notifications for a week. You'll realize how much they controlled your focus. Expanded insight. Dopamine, often called the reward chemical, isn't just about pleasure. It's about anticipation. Unpredictable rewards trigger higher dopamine surges, explaining why social media, gambling, and even toxic relationships can be so addictive. By understanding dopamine loops, one can recognize manipulative tactics and regain control over personal attention and desires. 9. Reverse psychology's dark side. Don't think about sleeping. Now that's all you can focus on. Why it works. The brain struggles with negations, making forbidden things more tempting. Where it's used. Parents, advertisers, and interrogators use this technique to steer behavior by suggesting the opposite of what they want. Devious use. In relationships, suggesting, "I know you don't want to talk about this," makes the other person more likely to engage. Expanded insight. Reverse psychology is a cornerstone of psychological warfare, persuasion, and negotiation. By subtly positioning an idea as off-limits or undesirable, manipulators can steer targets toward the exact outcome they want. Understanding this trick allows one to both resist external manipulation and apply it when necessary. 10. False memory. Implantation. Your brain can be tricked into remembering things that never happened. Psychological study. Elizabeth Loftus's research showed that witnesses could be made to recall entirely fabricated events. Real-world consequences. People have confessed to crimes they never committed due to suggestive questioning. Weaponized use. Planting false memories in someone can permanently alter their perception of past events, making them easier to manipulate. Expanded insight. Memory is far more malleable than most people realize. Repeated exposure to misleading information can cause people to remember things that never occurred. This phenomenon is often exploited in propaganda, cult indoctrination, and personal relationships where gaslighting is involved. Understanding how memories can be influenced is crucial to defending against psychological manipulation. 11.15. Psychological entrapment techniques. 11. The foot in the door technique. Small commitments lead to complete submission. Psychological study, Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser's experiment showed that people were more likely to comply with a large request if they first agreed to a small one. Real-world application. Cults, salespeople, and political movements use this trick to slowly condition individuals into deeper commitment. Dark use. A manipulator may ask for a minor favor, like borrowing a small amount of money, and gradually escalate requests until the victim is fully entrapped. Expanded insight. Once someone commits to an idea, their self-image adjusts accordingly. A person who agrees to sign a harmless petition may later justify more extreme actions to remain consistent with their previous choices. Understanding this trick helps resist unwanted influence by recognizing when small agreements are setting the stage for larger manipulations. 12. The door-in-the-face technique. Start with an outrageous demand, then retreat to something reasonable. Psychological experiment. Robert Cialdini's research demonstrated that people are more likely to agree to a second, smaller request after refusing an initial, larger demand. Real-world application. Negotiators and salespeople use this to make their actual request seem more reasonable by comparison. Dark use. A manipulator may first demand something extreme, like a large sum of money, then compromise with a smaller but still unreasonable request, making the victim feel obligated to agree. Expanded insight. The brain is wired to reciprocate perceived concessions. When someone rejects an initial demand, they feel socially pressured to agree when the person compromises. Recognizing this psychological trick prevents being cornered into agreements. 13. The sunk cost fallacy. The more you invest, the harder it is to walk away, even if you're losing. Case study. Casinos thrive on this principle, keeping gamblers playing even when they are deep in losses. Real-world application. Toxic relationships, bad business decisions, and prolonged wars all benefit from this psychological trap. Dark use. Manipulators keep victims trapped by making them feel that abandoning a commitment would mean wasting everything they've already put in. Expanded insight. Humans are loss-averse creatures. The fear of wasted effort makes people irrationally committed to failing ventures. Understanding this bias helps one make decisions based on future potential rather than past investments. 14. Gaslighting. Manipulating someone into questioning their reality. Psychological study. Dr. Robin Stern's work on gaslighting reveals how persistent psychological manipulation can distort memories and perceptions. Real-world application. Abusive partners, political leaders, and even corporations use this technique to control narratives. Dark use. By repeatedly denying facts, shifting blame, and creating confusion, a manipulator can make their target feel insane and dependent on them for reality validation. Expanded insight. Gaslighting is particularly dangerous because it isolates victims. The key defense against gaslighting is keeping objective records and trusting one's intuition despite external invalidation. 15. Stockholm Syndrome captives develop emotional bonds with their captors. Case study. The 1973 Norrmalmstorg bank robbery in Sweden gave birth to the term when hostages defended their captors. Real-world application. This psychological response appears in abusive relationships, cults, and even corporate loyalty structures. Dark use. A manipulator isolates their target, creates dependency, and alternates kindness with cruelty to trigger emotional bonding. Expanded insight. Stockholm Syndrome is an evolutionary survival mechanism. The brain rewires itself to reduce stress in captivity by forming attachments. Recognizing this trick helps break unhealthy emotional ties before they become too deeply ingrained. 16 to 20. The science of mind control. 16. Learned helplessness. When failure becomes an expectation, people stop trying, even when escape is possible. Psychological experiment. Martin Seligman's study on dogs demonstrated that after repeated exposure to unavoidable shocks, the animals eventually stopped trying to escape, even when given an easy way out. Real-world application. Victims of prolonged abuse, toxic workplaces, and political oppression often fall into this mental trap, believing they have no power to change their situation. Dark use. Manipulators break people's spirits by subjecting them to repeated failure, ensuring they accept their fate rather than resisting. Expanded insight. The key to breaking free from learned helplessness is recognizing small victories and rebuilding a sense of control, even in seemingly powerless situations. 17. Authority bias. People obey perceived authority figures, even against their moral judgment. Psychological study. Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiment showed that ordinary people would administer potentially fatal shocks to a stranger simply because an authority figure told them to. Real-world application. Governments, religious institutions, and corporations use uniforms, titles, and formal language to create unquestioning obedience. Dark use. A manipulator can exploit authority bias by presenting themselves as an expert or aligning with an authoritative institution to gain control over others.
Expanded insight. Understanding authority bias allows individuals to critically assess commands rather than blindly following figures of power. 18. The scarcity principle. People value things more when they seem rare or limited. Marketing tactic. Companies create artificial scarcity with limited time offers to drive consumer demand. Real-world application. Exclusive clubs, luxury brands, and even dating dynamics exploit this psychological bias. Dark use. Manipulators make themselves appear scarce to increase their perceived value, whether in relationships, business, or social influence. Expanded insight. Recognizing scarcity as an emotional trigger can help individuals make rational decisions instead of impulse-driven choices. 19. The halo effect. Attractive or charismatic people are assumed to be more intelligent, kind, or capable, whether or not they are. Psychological study. Edward Thorndike's research found that people rate physically attractive individuals higher in unrelated traits like intelligence and morality. Real-world application. Charismatic leaders, celebrities, and influencers benefit from this bias, often gaining trust without scrutiny. Dark use. Manipulators use appearance and charm to distract from unethical behavior, gaining power over those who fail to look beyond the surface. Expanded insight. The best defense against the halo effect is evaluating people based on their actions rather than their superficial traits. 20. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. Once you notice something, you see it everywhere. Psychological study. This cognitive bias explains why people suddenly see a new word, car model, or idea everywhere after encountering it once. Real-world application. Advertisers and political campaigns use this effect to make messages seem omnipresent and inescapable. Dark use. Manipulators subtly introduce ideas into conversation, making their targets believe they are encountering signs or patterns, leading them toward a predetermined conclusion. Expanded insight. Recognizing this trick allows people to question whether repeated exposure is natural or artificially orchestrated. 21-25. The dark side of influence. 21. The bystander effect. The more people witness an event, the less likely any one of them is to take action. Psychological experiment. The infamous 1964 case of Kitty Genovese led to research by John Darley and Bibb Latané, who found that individuals are less likely to help when they believe others will. Real-world application. This phenomenon explains why people ignore emergencies, hesitate in group settings, and why crowds can witness horrific events without intervening. Dark use. Manipulators exploit this by ensuring responsibility is diffused, making people hesitate to act, whether in corporate misconduct, criminal activities, or social manipulation. Expanded insight. Overcoming the bystander effect requires taking personal responsibility, even in group settings. The trick is to understand that waiting for others to act often means no one will. 22. The chameleon effect. Subtle mirroring of another person's behavior creates subconscious bonding. Psychological study. Psychologists Tanya Chartrand and John Bargh found that people unconsciously mimic those they interact with, leading to increased trust and social connection. Real-world application. Salespeople, politicians, and con artists use mirroring techniques to create a false sense of familiarity and trust. Dark use. Manipulators subtly mimic body language, tone, and speech patterns to lower defenses and gain influence over their targets. Expanded insight. Recognizing forced or unnatural mirroring can help one identify when someone is using this technique for manipulation rather than genuine connection. 23. Emotional contagion. Emotions spread like a virus, influencing those around them.
Psychological experiment. Studies by Elaine Hatfield showed that people unconsciously synchronize emotions, often adopting the moods of those they interact with. Real-world application. Social media, outrage, mob mentality, and even mass hysteria stem from emotional contagion. Dark use. Manipulators use high-energy emotions, fear, excitement, anger, to control crowds, influence decision-making, and create dependency. Expanded insight. Developing emotional awareness and critical thinking helps shield against being unconsciously swept up in the emotional states of others. 24. Fear appeals. Fear is one of the most powerful motivators, often overriding logic. Psychological study. Research shows that fear-based messaging, such as anti-smoking campaigns, works best when paired with an immediate action step. Real-world application. Governments, news media, and corporations use fear to control behaviors, from war propaganda to public health messaging. Dark use. A manipulator can manufacture crises, creating dependency and obedience by presenting themselves as the sole solution to the threat. Expanded insight. Recognizing when fear is being artificially amplified helps prevent irrational decision-making based on panic rather than logic. 25. The contrast principle. Perception shifts based on comparison rather than absolute value. Psychological study. Studies show that a $100 jacket seems expensive until compared to a $1,000 suit, making the price feel reasonable. Real-world application. Marketers and salespeople use this principle to make options seem more appealing based on contrast. Dark use. Manipulators use this effect to make a slightly unethical choice seem acceptable by presenting it next to a truly extreme alternative. Expanded insight. Understanding how contrast distorts perception allows individuals to judge options based on merit rather than deceptive comparisons. 2630. Psychological manipulation in everyday life. 26. The foot in the door technique. Small requests pave the way for bigger demands. Psychological study. In 1966, psychologists Friedman and Fraser found that people were more likely to comply with large requests after first agreeing to small ones. Real-world application. Marketers use free samples or trial offers to create commitment, making customers more likely to buy later. Dark use. Scammers and cult leaders exploit this principle by first asking for minor favors before escalating demands. Expanded insight. Understanding this technique helps individuals recognize when they are being gradually conditioned into compliance. 27. The door-in-the-face technique. Starting with an extreme request makes a smaller request seem reasonable. Psychological study. Robert Cialdini found that participants were more likely to agree to a request after rejecting a much larger one. Real-world application. Charities often ask for large donations first, knowing people are more likely to give a smaller amount afterward. Dark use. Manipulators use this to make unreasonable demands seem acceptable by presenting them after an exaggerated initial request. Expanded insight. Recognizing when expectations are being deliberately distorted helps prevent being manipulated by this tactic. 28. Social proof and herd mentality. People follow the crowd, often without critical thinking. Psychological study. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments demonstrated that individuals often conform to group opinions even when they are clearly incorrect. Real-world application. Businesses use customer testimonials and bestseller labels to influence consumer behavior. Dark use. Cults, extremist groups, and manipulative leaders exploit social proof to suppress independent thinking. Expanded insight. Cultivating independent reasoning skills helps individuals resist the urge to conform blindly. 29. The scarcity effect. Limited availability increases perceived value. Psychological study.
Research shows that people desire things more when they are in short supply or difficult to obtain. Real-world application. Marketers use limited time offers to create urgency and boost sales. Dark use. Manipulators manufacture scarcity, whether in relationships, information, or opportunities, to create desperation and compliance. Expanded insight. Recognizing artificial scarcity prevents being rushed into decisions based on fear of missing out. 30. The sunk cost fallacy. People continue investing in failing endeavors due to previous commitments. Psychological study. Studies have shown that people persist in failing investments because they feel they've already put in too much to quit. Real-world application. Gamblers, investors, and business owners often continue down losing paths because of past investments. Dark use. Manipulators exploit this by making people feel too invested to walk away, whether in abusive relationships or fraudulent schemes. Expanded insight. Learning to cut losses and make rational decisions based on present circumstances rather than past investments is crucial. 31 to 35. Psychological warfare and deception. 31. Gaslighting. Systematically making someone doubt their own reality. Psychological study. Studies on abusive relationships show that gaslighting erodes confidence, making victims easier to control. Real-world application. Abusive partners, cult leaders, and corrupt institutions use gaslighting to create dependence and obedience. Dark use. A manipulator can twist facts, deny past statements, or subtly alter reality until the victim questions their own sanity. Expanded insight. Recognizing gaslighting tactics and maintaining objective records, such as journals, can help resist this insidious form of manipulation. 32. The fear-then-relief technique. Creating anxiety before offering relief increases compliance. Psychological study. Research shows that people experiencing sudden fear become more susceptible to requests when relief is immediately provided. Real-world application. Law enforcement, interrogators, and even salespeople use this tactic to push compliance by first creating stress and then offering a reassuring alternative. Dark use. Cults and organizations use this technique by making recruits fear an external threat, then presenting themselves as the saviors. Expanded insight. Recognizing sudden shifts from fear to relief in interactions can signal manipulation attempts. 33. The familiarity principle in persuasion. The more familiar something is, the more we trust it. Psychological study. Studies in cognitive science reveal that repetition increases believability, even when the repeated information is false. Real-world application. Politicians, advertisers, and propaganda machines repeat messages to ingrain them in the public consciousness. Dark use. A manipulator can repeat subtle falsehoods over time, gradually altering a person's perception of reality. Expanded insight. Questioning repeated narratives, even from trusted sources, helps maintain critical thinking. 34. The halo effect. Attractiveness, or one positive trait, influences overall perception. Psychological study. Research shows that people attribute intelligence, kindness, and competence to those they find physically attractive. Real-world application. Employers favor attractive candidates, and juries are more lenient toward good-looking defendants. Dark use. Charismatic leaders and manipulators exploit the halo effect to gain trust and power while hiding flaws. Expanded insight. Evaluating individuals based on actions rather than appearance helps counteract the halo effect. 35. The broken record technique. Relentless repetition can break resistance. Psychological study. Studies in negotiation show that repeating a request without deviation increases the likelihood of compliance. Real-world application. Telemarketers, interrogators, and manipulative individuals use this technique to wear down opposition. Dark use. A manipulator may repeat a falsehood so often that the target starts to believe it simply due to its persistence. Expanded insight. Recognizing when someone is deliberately repeating themselves as a strategy can help maintain mental resilience. 3640. The power of cognitive biases. 36. Confirmation bias. People seek out information that supports their beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. Psychological study. Research by Charles Lord demonstrated that individuals presented with conflicting information about capital punishment only strengthened their pre-existing beliefs. Real-world application. Social media algorithms reinforce confirmation bias by curating content that aligns with users' existing viewpoints, creating echo chambers. Dark use. Manipulators feed selective information to shape someone's perception of reality. Expanded insight. Practicing skepticism and exposing oneself to diverse perspectives can help counter confirmation bias. 37. The availability. Heuristic people judge the likelihood of events based on how easily they recall similar instances. Psychological study. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman found that people overestimate the frequency of dramatic events, like plane crashes, due to media exposure. Real-world application. News outlets sensationalize crimes, making people believe danger is more prevalent than it actually is. Dark use. Politicians and media manipulate public perception by highlighting rare but emotionally charged incidents. Expanded insight. Fact-checking and statistical analysis help mitigate the distortions caused by the availability heuristic. 38. The Dunning-Kruger effect. People with low ability overestimate their competence, while experts underestimate theirs. Psychological study. David Dunning and Justin Kruger's research showed that incompetence often prevents people from recognizing their own lack of skill. Real-world application. Social media amplifies uninformed opinions, leading to widespread misinformation. Dark use. Manipulators exploit this effect by encouraging overconfidence in individuals who lack expertise, making them easier to control. Expanded insight. Cultivating humility and continuous learning counteracts the Dunning-Kruger effect. 39. The bandwagon effect. People adopt beliefs or behaviors because others are doing the same. Psychological study. Studies show that individuals conform to group opinions even when they conflict with personal judgment. Real-world application. Fashion trends, political movements, and viral challenges rely on this bias. Dark use. Cults and extremist groups use social pressure to reinforce conformity and suppress dissent. Expanded insight. Developing independent thinking and questioning popular trends can prevent falling victim to the bandwagon effect. 40. The framing effect. People's decisions are influenced by how information is presented. Psychological study. Tversky and Kahneman's experiments demonstrated that people react differently to choices, depending on whether they are framed as gains or losses. Real-world application. Marketers use positive framing, e.g., 90% success rate instead of 10% failure rate, to influence consumer choices. Dark use. Political rhetoric and propaganda manipulate public opinion by carefully framing issues. Expanded insight. Recognizing framing tactics helps maintain objective decision-making. 41 to 45. Social engineering and persuasion techniques. For 1. The foot-in-the-door technique. People are more likely to agree to a large request if they first agree to a small one. Psychological study. Friedman and Fraser found that participants who agreed to display a small sticker in their window were more likely to later accept a larger sign in their yard. Real-world application. Salespeople, recruiters, and cults use this technique to gradually increase commitment. Dark use. Manipulators slowly escalate demands,
so victims don't realize they're being controlled. Expanded insight. Recognizing incremental compliance helps avoid unwanted commitments. 42. The door-in-the-face technique. A large request is rejected, making a smaller request seem more reasonable. Psychological study. Cialdini's research showed that people were more likely to agree to volunteer after first refusing a much larger request. Real-world application. Negotiators and salespeople anchor expectations high before presenting their true ask. Dark use. Manipulators use exaggerated demands to make victims feel guilty for rejecting them, making them more likely to comply later. Expanded insight. Recognizing this tactic helps resist pressured decision-making. 43. The scarcity principle. People perceive rare or limited items as more valuable. Psychological study. Studies show that when supply is restricted, demand increases dramatically. Real-world application. Marketers use phrases like limited time offer to create urgency. Dark use. Cults and organizations create exclusivity to increase perceived value and control. Expanded insight. Evaluating choices rationally rather than emotionally reduces susceptibility to scarcity manipulation. 44. The reciprocity principle. People feel obligated to return favors. Psychological study. Regan's study showed that participants who received a small gift were more likely to reciprocate with larger favors. Real-world application. Free samples and gifts in marketing create subconscious pressure to buy. Dark use. Manipulators use small gestures of kindness to build leverage over others. Expanded insight. Recognizing when generosity has hidden motives helps maintain autonomy. 45. The authority bias. People are more likely to obey perceived authority figures. Psychological study. Milgram's famous obedience experiment demonstrated that individuals follow authority even when it contradicts their morals. Real-world application. Hierarchical structures in military, government, and corporations exploit this bias. Dark use. Manipulators wear uniforms, use titles, or claim expertise to gain compliance. Expanded insight. Questioning authority and verifying expertise prevents blind obedience. 46.50. Psychological traps that influence behavior. 46. The commitment and consistency principle. Once people commit to an idea or action, they feel psychological pressure to remain consistent. Psychological study. Cialdini's experiments showed that people who publicly commit to a belief are more likely to stick to it, even when presented with opposing evidence. Real-world application. Political groups, brands, and social movements use this to maintain loyalty among followers. Dark use. Manipulators extract small commitments to make victims more likely to comply with larger demands. Expanded insight. Questioning commitments and re-evaluating beliefs prevents falling into consistency traps. 47. The sunk cost fallacy. People continue investing in something simply because they've already put time, money, or effort into it. Psychological study. Studies show that gamblers and investors often make irrational decisions based on past expenditures rather than logical evaluation. Real-world application. Businesses exploit this by introducing subscription models that keep users engaged despite diminishing value. Dark use. Abusive relationships and manipulative organizations use this to trap individuals into staying in harmful situations. Expanded insight. Recognizing sunk costs allows for rational decision-making rather than emotional attachment to past investments. 48. The illusion of choice. People believe they are making free choices when, in reality, their options have been carefully curated. Psychological study. Research shows that when people are given limited options, they rarely question
whether better alternatives exist. Real-world application. Supermarkets and online platforms design choices to steer consumers toward profitable outcomes. Dark use. Governments and corporations use controlled opposition to give the illusion of choice while maintaining control. Expanded insight. Expanding one's awareness of hidden alternatives allows for more informed decision-making. 49. Emotional contagion. People subconsciously absorb the emotions of those around them. Psychological study. Facebook's experiment on emotional contagion showed that manipulating a person's newsfeed could influence their mood. Real-world application. Public speakers, media personalities, and social movements spread emotions to influence large groups. Dark use. Manipulators use feigned emotions to trigger specific reactions in their targets. Expanded insight. Becoming aware of emotional influence helps maintain independent emotional stability. 50. The illusory truth effect. Repeated exposure to a statement makes people more likely to believe it, even if it's false. Psychological study. Experiments show that the more often people hear a claim, the more familiar and credible it feels. Real-world application. Propaganda, advertising, and misinformation campaigns rely on repetition to shape public perception. Dark use. Manipulators repeat falsehoods until they become ingrained in their target's beliefs. Expanded insight. Fact-checking and skepticism help counteract the illusory truth effect. 51 to 55. Exploiting the weaknesses of human perception. 51. Change blindness. People fail to notice significant changes in their environment when their attention is elsewhere. Psychological study. Simons and Levin's famous experiment showed that individuals often don't notice when a person they're talking to is swapped out for another. Real-world application. Magicians and pickpockets exploit this by directing attention away from crucial movements. Dark use. Con artists and scammers use change blindness to deceive victims without them realizing. Expanded insight. Developing mindfulness and situational awareness helps counteract change blindness. 52. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, frequency illusion. Once people learn about something, they start noticing it everywhere. Psychological study. Studies show that repeated exposure to an idea creates a cognitive bias where people falsely believe its frequency has increased. Real-world application. Advertisers use this to make products seem omnipresent, reinforcing brand recognition. Dark use. Cults and conspiracies exploit this to make their beliefs seem more prevalent than they are. Expanded insight. Recognizing frequency illusion prevents the false belief that an idea or trend is more common than it actually is. 53. The halo effect. A person's overall impression of someone influences their judgment of that person's specific traits. Psychological study. Research shows that attractive people are often perceived as more intelligent and competent, even without evidence. Real-world application. Job interviews and courtroom decisions are influenced by this bias. Dark use. Manipulators enhance their perceived credibility by cultivating an appealing appearance or reputation. Expanded insight. Evaluating people based on facts rather than appearance prevents misjudgments. 54. The contrast effect. People's perceptions of something are influenced by what they've recently experienced. Psychological study. If someone is exposed to an extreme stimulus first, their perception of a subsequent milder stimulus is altered. Real-world application. Retailers show expensive products first so that mid-range options seem more affordable. Dark use. Negotiators and influencers manipulate perception by strategically structuring comparisons. Expanded insight. Being aware of contrast effects
helps in making more objective decisions. 55. Perceptual set. Expectations influence what people perceive. Psychological study. Studies show that when people are primed with certain ideas, they interpret ambiguous stimuli to match those expectations. Real-world application. Media and storytelling shape public perception by controlling the framing of information. Dark use. Propagandists and manipulators use framing to alter perception and control narratives. Expanded insight. Recognizing framing effects helps in distinguishing perception from reality. 56 to 60. The dark psychology of compliance and control. 56. Learned helplessness. When people experience repeated failures or trauma, they eventually stop trying to escape, even when a way out exists. Psychological study. Seligman's experiments with dogs showed that after being exposed to inescapable shocks, they stopped trying to escape even when an opportunity was provided. Real-world application. Abusive relationships and toxic work environments foster learned helplessness, making victims less likely to leave. Dark use. Authoritarian regimes and manipulators condition people into accepting oppression by making them feel powerless. Expanded insight. Recognizing patterns of learned helplessness is the first step toward breaking free from its grip. 57. Authority bias. People are more likely to obey commands from figures of authority, even when those commands are unethical. Psychological study. The infamous Milgram experiment revealed that ordinary people would administer dangerous electric shocks simply because an authority figure told them to. Real-world application. Governments, medical professionals, and corporate leaders use perceived authority to shape public compliance. Dark use. Cults and extremist groups use authoritative figures to manipulate followers into unquestioning obedience. Expanded insight. Questioning authority and seeking independent verification prevents blind obedience. 58. The Stockholm Syndrome effect. Victims develop loyalty and affection toward their captors as a survival mechanism. Psychological study. The 1973 bank robbery in Stockholm led to the coining of this term when hostages defended their captors after being released. Real-world application. Kidnapping victims, abuse survivors, and prisoners of war often exhibit this psychological response. Dark use. Abusive partners and hostage-takers use isolation and small acts of kindness to create psychological dependency. Expanded insight. Recognizing manipulative emotional bonds helps break free from Stockholm Syndrome dynamics. 59. Fear-based conditioning. Fear is one of the most powerful motivators, often overriding logic and rational thinking. Psychological study. Pavlov's experiments showed that animals and humans can be conditioned to associate neutral stimuli with fear responses. Real-world application. Political campaigns and media use fear to sway public opinion and increase compliance. Dark use. Manipulators use threats, whether implicit or explicit, to control behavior and prevent resistance. Expanded insight. Understanding fear-based tactics helps individuals resist emotional manipulation. 60. The gaslighting effect. A person is made to question their own reality, leading them to doubt their own perceptions and memories. Psychological study. Cases of gaslighting have been documented in abusive relationships, where the victim begins to question their sanity due to repeated psychological manipulation. Real-world application. Abusers, cult leaders, and corrupt institutions use gaslighting to control individuals. Dark use. Manipulators systematically alter facts, deny reality, and introduce false information to erode their victim's sense of truth. Expanded insight. Identifying gaslighting patterns and trusting one's own perceptions help counteract this psychological attack. Conclusion.
Throughout this journey into the darkest psychological tricks, we've uncovered the hidden mechanisms that influence human behavior, often without conscious awareness. These techniques, used by governments, corporations, manipulators, and even loved ones, shape decisions, beliefs, and actions in ways most people never realize. Understanding these tactics grants a form of psychological immunity. Awareness is power. When you recognize manipulation, you take back control over your mind, your decisions, and ultimately, your life. As you drift into sleep, let these lessons settle in your subconscious. You are now armed with knowledge that most people will never grasp. And with this understanding, you can choose, will you be the one manipulated or the one in control?